Hello out there. I am here again with you on Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, where we discuss only the indigenous sign languages of African community. Today, we are going to launch into another episode of the series that we've been doing for the past few weeks now. Learn from your Indigenous Deaf Signers. And I know if you have been following me in this program, especially recently, you would have been very familiar with Aisha's story. Okay, that is, one of the most beautiful episodes we've done here. So after Aisha, in the last episode, we met with Murtala. Murtala is another deaf signer from whom we are learning about some of the signing skills that exist in some of our indigenous deaf communities. And so in the last episode, we started the Murtala's interview, and we saw a couple of segments. What is your name? How are you? Hope you're happy. What is your name? And Murtala says, they call me Long Nose. So we will continue in Murtala's interview today, and we hope to take possibly a couple of segments and see how Murtala's interview goes. And I want you to sit tight. This is still the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, that is brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. And we are so glad that what we are doing here is making waves across African deaf communities. And so we want to say, keep following us on this program. If you know you are learning a thing or two, keep sharing our video. If you know there are those that they will benefit, and do not relent to dive into the community of advocates for the promotion of indigenous sign languages. Of course, our YouTube channel is going everywhere, and our Facebook page, people are busy discussing indigenous sign languages. So if you have not known about that, well, know it today about the advocates for the indigenous sign languages. And if you want to be part of that community, you are welcome. All right, without wasting any further time, let's see Murtala in the continuation of his interview. So the first segment we want to consider in today's interview of Murtala is the segment that asks him, how old are you? And he responds by saying, I am 25 years old. Now, if you look at that segment, you will believe me that the segment is a little bit complex. So the question, how old are you, begins with the sign ye, and you have ye, child growing, ye what? So in that sign, I have 5 good movements that indicates the question, how old are you? And the first movement is the movement to sign ye, ye, child, growing, ye, what? And so the first one, ye, is the question, how old? But the second ye we find in that segment seems to me like an emphasis. And I want to believe that this whole sign can be signed maybe with elimination of the second year. I'm not too sure, but let's look at this segment the way it is. So, year, child growing, year, what? So, looking at the movements, I get 5 movements from year to child to growing and year again what? Same way I get 5 segments of that sign. And then if we go to look at the hand shapes, we have various hand shapes that feature in this sign. The hand shape for year, which of course is made up of the 2 palms forming the B hand shape, different orientations coming together with this as the active articulator, and this is a passive. And then we still have the same B hand shape or open hand shape more traditionally in child. Of course, this is the conventional sign for child as we have expressed in the previous videos. So child, growing, and the same hand shape, upward movement, and come back to year, same sign we saw, and the sign for what, which also ends in open hand shape. What? Open hand shape. So it is as good as asking how many years do you have, just like we find in some spoken languages, when instead of saying how old are you, how many years do you have. I think French is one of those languages that could ask you in that format. Quel âge as-tu? Quel âge as-tu? How old are you? What age do you have? Quel âge as-tu? All right. Or quel âge avez-vous? So that is the sign for how old are you. Year, child, growing up, year, what? Looking at this sign from the face value, looking at this sign from the surface structure, it doesn't seem to me that it really directly translates into how old are you. Look at the structure. Age, child, growing, age, what? This is one of the sign segments that shows us how deep some signs can be, how arbitrary some signs can be also. If you dissect this entire sign, you might get features of iconicity. But in my opinion, the entire sign seems to me more arbitrary than iconic. Let me not break your head with these 2 words. I don't intend to, okay? So forgive me. So what I mean is, this is a whole sign segment that doesn't seem to me that it has a direct relationship with what it signifies. But if you also break the sign, split the sign into little segments, you will get child, which is a little bit more iconic than the other segments. You will also get growing up, which I believe is more iconic than the other ones. I would say that the sign for what has some iconic particles too. But in adjacent relationship with the rest of the sign segments, the sign seems to be more arbitrary than it is iconic. Why am I discussing arbitrariness and iconicity here today again? It is because I know in the previous episodes I have dwelt more on iconicity, and I also said that iconicity is a very prominent feature of the indigenous sign languages, especially those that we've studied. And one of the reasons is because of the supposed amount of gestures that we see in indigenous sign languages. But that does not rule out the possibility of seeing very complex signs and sign segments that are very much more arbitrary than iconic. And I think that the sign we are looking at, how old are you, is more arbitrary in nature than iconic. And I'm very fascinated about the different segments that make up the string. The age, the child growing, age, what? Giving us 5 steps and 5 movements, different handshapes, more of the open handshake though. Okay, I didn't see much of the facial expression or non-manual signing going on here. As a compliment, I think everything about the sign seems to be on the hands. Okay, and let's look at Murtala's response. And Murtala begins by saying, yeah, 25. Yeah, 25. Now, I am interested more on the 25. Murtala signs 25 with all the 10 fingers plus the 10 toes, then additional 5 being raised to complete the counting. Now, it is interesting to me that Murtala complements the 10 fingers counting with the 10 toes, because in this community and in some other communities we've seen, you will see some signers counting all the 20 on the fingers, and we have seen that Murtala counts the 20 both on the fingers and on the toes, which is very, very interesting. And so this is 10, this is 5. And usually when we were documenting this sign language, many signers counted 10 for us this way. But you see that the grappolo hand, don't mind the big word, the grappolo hand that Murtala uses to sign the 25, rather than making it look like the sign for equality, the palm orientation changes, facing downwards. They face downward to call onto the remaining numerals on the toes. On its own, 5 and 10 are not signed with the palm facing down. They are signed this way, and this is 10. So when you also want to make 20, you make it here, making it twice. But Murtala didn't sign I am. He signed I do not know if this has to do with maybe a feature of the signer, which we'll call idiosyncrasy, or an attribute of where the signer must have learned to sign. Because if I play all the segments of the signers when they're asked their age, you're gonna get some varieties. You're gonna get a different thing from what Murtala signed, especially in the tens. So what you're gonna see is more of the signers showing us the age here like this. And when we are counting, all the tens were counted. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 40. And then if there's going to be a 5, it is going to be signed this way. But it is interesting to learn how Murtala signed his age. This is why we discuss the indigenous sign languages, because in our opinion, there are beautiful things going on in our indigenous sign languages that we overlook, that we neglect, because we are pursuing those sign languages that look like what is sent from above. not in this channel. Let's look at the second segment that Murtala signed. Okay, the next sign we saw on the video is a sign for where do you come from, or what is your village, or what is your town. In another way to say, where were you born? And the sign, as you can see on the video, has a few segments also. So the first sign we saw there is a sign, this, striking back with open hand. Initially, I thought that that was a sign for where. And when I checked, compared with other collections that we have, that's not the sign for where. That's the sign for where you hail from. It could be your village, it could be your town, but this sign is a noun and not the sign for where. And so he begins by this sign, and this movement, he did it twice. And this is a movement for where. This is a sign for where. So in other words, it is signed literally as village, for instance, of yours, where, village or hometown, where. So if you look at the sign, if you notice that it also ends in this sign, which is what? So it is like asking village, where, and what. And in another sense, I'm beginning to think that this sign has a double meaning, or has relatively more than one meaning, and which can include what, and possibly how or why. Now Murtala responds to say, Murtala didn't say my village is, or he did not say I am coming from. His response is different, and he says, he gives us three movement signs. The first is the sign to indicate birth, and the second is a pointing, a distant pointing, and the name of the village. So Murtala's response shows that I was born in a distant place called Zaria. Now, Murtala's response structurally is different from the question that he was asked, but he answered the question that he was asked. And what am I trying to arrive at? Just like we have varieties of ways we express ourselves in spoken English, just like a person believes that a developed sign language has several ways of one expressing oneself in it, our indigenous sign languages have various ways we can express ourselves. If we learn from Murtala's response to the question, where do you hail from, or where were you born, you understand that we have very beautiful ways of self-expression in the indigenous sign languages. So today, we were able to see Murtala's response to two segments of signs. The first one being, how old are you? And he responds, I am 25 years old. The second one being, where were you born, or what is your village? And he responds that I was born in Zaria. And I didn't want to go further to talk about the hand shapes and movements that are associated with the sign I was born in Zaria. But one aspect I wanted to point out is the pointing. Murtala pointed in a distant place, in a neutral place. And his pointing indicates that he is talking about a place that is not here. And pointing is one of the aspects, like I have discussed with us here, that scholars have taken on to see what happens both in spoken and sign languages when we point. Murtala's pointing style in this response shows that he is pointing to a distant place. Different communities have been studied about how they point to something in the remote and something in the proximal position. In this case, he still points with the index finger pointed upward. Some communities point in the distance with all of their fingers and with the hand stretched. I'm trying to accommodate my hand within my space. So Murtala's distant pointing indicates that the place he's born is not where he is, and he gives the name of it. And let's look at the structure of Murtala's response too. First of all, he said born, distant place, name. So the structure doesn't give us a typical English structure that we speak, which is something that is very outstanding in our indigenous sign languages. When we talk about indigenous sign languages as opposed to the sign language system that is used in the schools for the deaf in some African countries, Nigeria for instance, whereby everything seems to want to follow the English structure, English word structure or sentence structure. So in this interview, Murtala's expression, the interviewer himself, all of their expression, the two segments we've seen today, you can bear witness that none of which followed any English structure, word structure. This is why it is indigenous. Expressions are made according to how people, the owners of the language, have seen themselves expressing themselves without wanting to form their mannerisms according to another language, according to another linguistic culture. Indigenous sign languages are full-fledged languages. They do not care what you are signing in your community. They sign what they have come to inherit as their linguistic identity. Murtala is not trying to please anybody, not the interviewer, not the audience, not the interpreter. He's not trying to embellish his signing. He gives it raw. The interviewer, the same, who is also a bilingual, expresses himself in the indigenous, not trying to mix it up with the other variety that he is knowledgeable in. In indigenous sign language, you can express yourself without any corruption of the signing system. And that is why we're so glad to talk about the indigenous signing systems, especially of African deaf community, in this channel. And we do this bearing joy that we are making efforts towards promoting our cultural identities, promoting who we are. That's who we are. I thank you for being with me today in Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. In the next week, we will continue with Murtala's interview, and we will see how many more segments of his interview we'll look at, and we'll do that until we are done with this interview. Don't go nowhere. Sit tight. All right. You'll be glad to see you again next week. Until then, be safe. Bye.